The next speaker is Barry Thompson, Barry is the librarian and bookshop manager and membership registrar for the English section. He joined the section in 1992, although he first encountered Theosophy in the early 1980s via the Astrological Lodge and the TS Bookshop in Great Russell Street. The title of his talk is Accept the All.
Well, good morning, everybody. What I propose to do today is outline some fundamental philosophical ideas that Theosophy establishes or proposes, some key themes based upon these ideas, and try to explore some of the consequences we might draw from these foregoing principles. HBB, in the Key to Theosophy, postulates the unity of all in all. Why is that phrasing all in all? She's referring to God, the soul, and man. Her thesis here is not that we add three things together to establish or perceive a unity, artificial or otherwise. In this part of the Key, chapter 6, she makes us aware that the lofty subjects she is referring to, deity, spirituality, humanity, are themselves parts of a grander whole, referred to in this passage as the unknowable deific essence. Now that is the beloved parabrahma of students of the secret doctrine, undefinable, and yet the subject of so much discussion in secret doctrine classes throughout the Theosophical universe. It is a pure monism. There is only one thing, but that one thing is without a true name or form to our darkened perceptions. We can approach it, invoke it through symbolism, poetry, intuition, yet it is always just beyond our grasp, however lofty our insights. Why? Because it is eternity itself, as the quote has it, casting a periodical reflection of itself on the infinite spatial depths. This reflection, our universe, our world, the manifold of whatever perceptions we may have or aspire to have, are illusions, not because they are unreal, but because they are finite. Whatever is, in that relative sense, however grand, however beautiful, will pass away into something else, perhaps more grand, more beautiful, and so on throughout eternity. We are aggregates of perceptions, our common human natures and individual viewpoints, the results of prior states of being, or perhaps I should say becomings, throughout this and many prior lives. And yet, despite this endless change and growth on our parts, the one principle is beyond our grasp. It would not be the all if its nature could be grasped by one or by many perceptions. There is always a greater, a beyond, not this, neti, to use the Upanishadic phrase. This sublime idea evokes many different responses in students. Bafflement is quite common, confusion that the key idea of a school of direct perception of spiritual realities, which is what Theosophy is, begins with something not directly perceivable per se. To some, it seems to destroy old certainties of fixed and unchanging realities, the changeless heaven taught in Sunday schools of years long past. Ernest Woods, the well-known Theosophical author, pointed out that it was a liberating idea, bringing realism to our grasp of fundamentals. I think he meant that the perceived separations and unities of our lives are provided by us, because our perceptions are just that, our perceptions. Our universe is bounded only by the scope of our perception. Now, this is not to fall into a naive idealism. We do not choose to be human in HBV's presentation. Our common humanity is the result of a common history, which in another aspect is referred to as karma, setting necessary limits and tasks. But within those boundaries, then, in the words of the Dhammapada, mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-wrought. If there is one key idea to take away here, may I suggest that a central theme is that Theosophy tries to teach us, recalcitrant creatures that we are, to look for the broadest picture that we can find, always aware that our ideas are provisional. Our search for knowledge begins with a due sense of our own ignorance when faced with the vastnesses of the universe. This is the first act of acceptance, the acknowledgement that our knowledge is limited at best, and that our control over our knowing is limited indeed. The mind is apt to overreach itself, and we should be aware of the tendency to think we know when we believe, and believe because we like what we have read or heard. If the first fundamental idea of Theosophy is an absolute towards which we strive but never happily reach, then I suggest that the second big idea is that of economy, the processes by and through which endless creation is husbanded. I mean, of course, the law of karma. The word itself in the Sanskrit comes, it seems, from the root to do, action, in other words. This concept of action is central, given that HBB in the key suggests that, in essence, karma itself is unknowable, something like the absolute, which formed our first point of departure. She also manages to say, in the Secret Doctrine commentaries and elsewhere, that karma does not act. Another paradox, perhaps? Fortunately, perhaps not. The activity of karma stems from ourselves, as it is we who, perhaps in some measure of both necessity and ignorance, set the chains of causation in action. In the key, HBB describes it as a law of readjustment, whichever tends to restore disturbed equilibrium in the physical and broken harmony in the mental world. We say that it does not act in this or that particular way always. Note this last phrase, if there are any determinists here amongst us, and I'm sure if you're here, then you were destined to be here. But it always acts in a way to restore harmony and preserve the balance of equilibrium, in virtue of which the universe exists. And that's from chapter 11, slightly paraphrased. We can see here a similar theme to that which began our inquiry, the concept of totality or the whole. Just as reality is more than any one aspect we may perceive, the main idea here, it seems to me, is that there is a balance which maintains itself through, and perhaps sometimes even at the expense of particular parts. If we remember the imagery of a reflection used in our discussion of the absolute, and imagine something reflected in a clear pool, if we ruffle those waters, the reflection is lost. Yet the ripples we make in the waters are the only way we have of restoring that original pristine image. Note also a passage from the Mahatma letters, which adds a necessary and interesting, I think, qualification to the above. And I'm giving the quote in its entirety, although it's not terribly long, you'll be glad to hear. The laws that govern our occult world do seem very often unjust, even at times cruel. But this is due to the fact that they were never meant either for the immediate redress of wrongs or the direct help of those who offer their allegiance to legislators. Still, the seemingly real, the evanescent, and quickly passing evils they bring about are necessary to the growth, progress, and final establishment of your small theosophical society, as those cataclysms in nature, which often decimate whole populations, are necessary to mankind. An earthquake may, for all the world knows, be a bliss, and a tidal wave prove salvation to the many at the expense of the few. That's from letter 134 in the chronological. Now, before anybody begins to impute callousness or a love of cataclysms to the Mahatmas, a few words of clarification. What the extract is dealing with at the beginning is the question of chelaship and the absence of personal concerns therefrom, and then going on to give a broader cosmic context with its concluding reference to geological upheavals. Note here the similar theme between the idea of the absolute and of karma, with its claim that our common human history is very often built not only on the shoulders of our forebears, but upon their tears as well. We may well wish for a perfect world, but perfection is nowhere to be found within manifestation, as manifestation is always just a partial approximation to the totality of the whole. Just as reality, in the truest sense, is something which is greater than any particular being, so the contributions of many individuals make of humanity a sum greater than its parts, and the sufferings, as well as the successes of mankind, make for a progress we as a part of manifestation have made and can make. If it were otherwise, there would be no need for change. And we've already established the claim that the only reality is the unchanging absolute. The question of our response to these events is an entirely different matter. In one of the writings, Annie Besant answered the suggestion that while it may well be the karma of somebody to suffer from poverty, for example, if we happen to believe that karma acts in that way, myself, I'm not so sure, it is our karma to help them. Yeah? This is a part of the great mystery of what HPB in the Key to Theosophy refers to as distributive karma, which is her response to the admission that mass suffering cannot be attributed to an aggregate of collective individual deeds. She tells us, quote, "It is impossible that karma could readjust the balance of power in the world's life unless it had a broad and general line of action. It is an occult law that no man can rise superior to his individual failings without lifting, be it ever so little, the whole body of which he is an integral part. In reality, there is no such thing as separateness." The question of karma is an intricate one. You may be aware of lists in some of the literature which give general characterizations of what type of effect will follow from what type of action. Given the complexity of human life, personally, I would take these things, these lists, attitudes, with a pinch of salt. If it's mathematically possible for a butterfly to flap its wings on one side of the world and a hurricane to result on the other, as chaos theory is supposed to tell us, approaches like this, this will happen automatically from that, seem to me to err on the side of mechanism. Perhaps the best karmic lesson that we can all learn is judge not, lest ye be judged, and help when you can. Thirdly, if, as the Dhammapada tells us, mind is key, what kind of minds are we talking about? Certainly not the type of mind involved in the making of shopping lists, not even the kind of mind that listens to theosophical lectures, and least of all, the types of minds that write them. In chapter 10 of the Key, HBB tells us that mind, manas, is both a principle and an entity and ego. A god, she uses the words in quotation marks, doomed to an endless cycle of incarnations, for each of which he is made responsible, and for each of which he has to suffer. Her attempted genealogy, to use her word for this entity, is that it is a celestial being, essentially divine and yet not pure enough to be with the all, purifying its nature in this task of reunion through passing, individually and personally, i.e., spiritually and physically, through every experience and feeling in the differentiated universe. In its very essence, it is thought, called collectively the Manasaputra and individually the human divine ego. Once again, we are faced with a mystery which has shed as many theosophical tears and used up as much theosophical ink as the mysteries of Parabrahm. If we are a part of the all, why the journey? If we are not quite a part, a semi-part, how can Parabrahm be the all? One of the earliest answers to this question I heard came from the late Adam Walkup, whose reply was that there was a difference between unconscious and conscious unity. Ponder on that. It suggests to me that there is no final end, as consciousness will move towards something else, a higher level of being beyond our mortal ken. An allegorical answer, a poetic answer, is given, I think, in the Enneads. I think I saw it, which tells us that while the sun does not intend to shine, it is in the nature of the sun to send rays of sunshine into the world. The point here, I suppose, and without wishing to destroy the poetic simplicity of the image, is that the rays do not detract from the self-sufficiency or complete being of the solar orb. My own studies, such as they are, have led me to the tentative conclusion that the answer lies somewhere in the fact that the absolute is beyond time, while everything that we see occurs within vast cycles of time. If there truly is a timeless state, then the passage of time experienced by beings in manifestation have no relevance with regards to that timelessness. We are not comparing like with like, and so the question is falsely based. Remember those old fairy stories that from our childhood, where visitors to fairyland spent a night there, only to find on their return to Earth that many centuries had passed. And the perfection and imperfection of manifestation is endless, as our teachings tell us that the process is of endless evolution on higher planes, not a simple repetition of identical states of being. As HBB says, each time it evolutes on a higher plane. A phrase that I created to inspire me in my early studies was pure potency giving rise to endless potentiality. I'm going to skip the next bit. I'm sure that some of you will, in your studies, have noticed a repetition of theme here between the knowable and unknowable. We began by suggesting that there is a principle that is in essence unknowable, then proceeded to talk about another topic, karma, also said to be in its innermost nature unknowable. But if we consider the relation of the various incarnatory personalities, our past lives as John Smith, or Anne Boleyn, as the case may be, to in relationship to the developing inner divinity we're discussing, we see a kind of a similar, if not identical pattern. Remember when HBB tells us that the law of analogy is one of the keys we have to understanding? HBB's presentation puts the onus on the development of the divine ego via a series of personalities, life after life. But the scope for most of us to know that divine ego directly seems somewhat limited, albeit not impossible. We may remember that sparse reference in the Secret Doctrine to the relationship between Dhyani Buddhas and monads, the former acting as a twin soul to the latter, whilst man, humble man, is forever ignorant of that fact. This relationship between the fullness of divinity and the littleness of man is a key theme of the spiritual path. But is the purpose of this path to divinize or transcend the personality? HBB does not seem to be very sympathetic to that former idea. She is rather wide-ranging in her use of terms for soul and spirit, no doubt in part due to the fluid and non-perceptual realities which she is describing. But in chapter 7 of the key, she's clear that the soul, seemingly equivalent with manas, wins its immortality by approaching divinity. The lower manas, gravitating towards the desire nature, is the personality. Our immortality, always provisional, is guaranteed by the union of manas and the monad, the inner God or inner divinity. And she puts it that the individualization of man after death depends on the spirit, not on his soul and body. Now that may strike some people as a bit of a not soul, it's spirit. But then much, if not all, of our personality is based upon, I'm afraid, I'm certainly speaking for myself, I'm not going to speak for any of you perhaps, much of my personality is based rather upon my biology rather than my body. As the old classification of the four humours may suggest. But this does raise the question, I suppose, as to what self we're looking to heal in order to heal the world. If by self we mean personality, then the scope for self-improvement is limited by the nature of the instrument and the broader nature of the type of human society in which it's operating. Might we then call for a reconstitution of society in order to foster a new spirit for the age? In chapter 12 of the key, HBB warns against political or sectarian actions, referring to the policy as putting new wine into old bottles, which is a phrase that's always struck me as rather odd, but shouldn't it be the other way around? It's old wine into new bottles, but hey-ho. There needs to be a change of hearts, is the key point, before there is a change of system. And she further elaborates political action, and remember that politics is a very wide, she's not talking party politics. Political action must necessarily vary with the circumstances of the time and with the idiosyncrasies of individuals. As Theosophists, we might regard our main focus as the eternal rather than the temporal, the spiritual verities which have the potential to underpin so many other actions. As HBB tells us, the expenditure of energy on a higher plane has the potential for much greater ramifications as the energy works down into manifestation. With regards to the question of social reform, she gives us her own definition as to what principles should underlie theosophical attempts as to what she refers to as social cooperation. It's a lovely phrase, that, isn't it? Social cooperation. These are universal unity and causation, human solidarity, the law of karma and reincarnation, otherwise described as the, as she says, 4 links of the golden chain, which should bind humanity into one family, one universal brotherhood. We might see the shadow of Parabrahm lurking behind those first and second principles, whilst karma and its corollary finish the quartet. Of course, and you'll be glad to hear this is my concluding point, Of course, despite our rugged individuality, we all possess a collective self as members of the Theosophical Society. And although the society may not be in need of healing, the coursing energy of revitalization and renewal never hurts, at least in theory. In the concluding section of the Key to Theosophy, HBB speculates about the future of the TS after her passing, which occurred barely 2 years or so after. What she says is that she called upon us to have an unbiased and clear judgment, as every previous attempt to create similar organizations in the past had ended in failure, as they had, to use the quote, degenerated into a sect with hard and fast dogmas which led them to lose the vitality of living truth. This is sometimes taken to mean that HBB didn't want the TS to concentrate on theosophical teachings. But I'm afraid I think that this is rather a weak reading. Firstly, she prefaces her statements with the acknowledgement that technical knowledge of the esoteric doctrine, as she refers to it, was most important. Secondly, and much more significantly, she expanded on her fears over dogmatism by pointing out that TS members had been, quote unquote, bred and born in some creed or religion. And she warned us of unconscious bias because of this. Her fears were that if this was not recognized, the TS would drift off onto some sandbank of thought. By that, I take it that she was referring to the dogmatic religions of her day and the literal interpretation of scriptures, something that did tend to revive itself in the post-Blavatsky period. The counter-argument that we often hear in respect to this is that the TS should not be sectarian, that its core literature is too narrow to build a mass movement upon. And my suggestion, my concluding suggestion, is that our mission is to form a nucleus and not try to be all things to all men. And that sometimes realizing that our dharma is to participate in the spiritual regeneration of the world and not assume to try to lead it is the greatest act of acceptance of all. Thank you.
On your behalf, I'd like to thank Barry for his very interesting and illuminating talk.